I know this is sort of like a hackneyed term now these days, but I really believe that the areas that China is really focused on are the building blocks for the next generation of technologies, emerging sectors that are going to be not only sort of like the economic growth engines, the job engines of the future, but sort of broader progress is going to be built on that. AI, robotics, all the stuff that we've all heard about. But I want to bring attention to some of those things too. It's not just today, it's like the trend going forward that people need to pay attention to.
Welcome to Manifold. My guest today is Kyle Chan. He is a postdoctoral researcher at Princeton University. He is interested in many of the themes that we discuss on this show, in particular, US-China technology competition, AI, globalization, multipolarity. Kyle, welcome to the show.
Great to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you. As I was just saying before we started recording, I've read a lot of your stuff. Two things I'd like to go over in some depth is the opinion piece you had in the New York Times recently, and also something on your Substack about industrial maximalism and a theorist at Beijing University named, I think his name is Lu Feng. And
that's right.
Those are two things I'd like to get into further on in the podcast. But the way I like to start my podcast is to learn a little bit more about you as a person. So I know that you studied economics at the University of Chicago, and then you did your PhD at Princeton in sociology. Maybe tell us about the development of your intellectual interests since from college to where you are today.
Yeah. So one of the long-standing questions that drives my research that actually has gotten me motivated for now, I guess, almost decades is the question of development, actually. So it's funny because now I talk a lot about industrial policy in China, even in the US, Europe, a lot of countries, India. And so it's like a big topic now, how can the state or can the state even do something to help move along industrial development? But this older question, I think, is still like the biggest question. Everyone says this about their field, right? But I think this is the biggest question out there. Why are some countries rich? Why are some countries poor? Why is it that if you were born in, some country in East Africa or in South Asia or in North America, your life is just so deeply shaped by just that place of birth and country of birth. And yeah, and it's a puzzling question because it transcends, fields. Economics is where I began, and I found a lot of the tools there useful, and especially a lot of the statistical tools, which are now kind of standards across the social sciences. That's a good thing. But I did find that the questions economists asked were getting narrower and narrower. So, I'm always up for a good RCT to rigorously test a hypothesis, but I felt like a lot of the biggest variables were not even being considered. And some of those are the hardest to, measure, quantify, to nail down. And so I just wanted to, make that shift over to sociology, which, I like to think of it as like the big tent discipline in terms of methodology and the types of questions you can ask. And so, yeah, you can study development by interviewing government officials at an organization that deals with development. You can use corporate financial data. You can, do sort of all these different things. You can mix it all together and just try to present sort of the strongest case you can for whatever theory you're arguing. So that's why I gradually found myself being drawn to sociology. And the questions still remain the same. Now the funny thing is, questions that I was asking about China, which I think is still also the biggest story in development. So if I think development's the biggest question, China's the biggest case. And I still think to this day, still begging to be explained. How did this country transform itself, basically in a generation, in a single lifetime, so dramatically, and have such huge consequences for the rest of the world that we're sort of dealing with right now. So yeah, to me, these were such big things. And sociology, I started to kind of, do field work. So I spent several years doing field work actually in both China and India, the comparative thing was really helpful. Because honestly, the first time I traveled to China as an adult, I went to Beijing it was like 2005, 2006 or something as an adult. And I was like, this place is kind of chaotic. It's kind of like all over the place. I remember getting, a bunch of, hacked together electronics on the cheap, things like that. And that was kind of like my association with China. And then, I traveled to India. They have their own different issues, their own different strengths. It just opened the world to me. So that comparative lens has also been very important to me. But yeah, that's sort of like the longer arc, this question of, how do countries become rich, basically? How do they get all the things that come along with that? Better healthcare, better education, all the things that I think really matter still.
Your dissertation work was on development of railways and comparing India.
Yes.
And China. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah. So that was really fun, in part because I got to take a lot of trains in both countries. And my question was like, how did China build this high-speed rail system that is now larger than the rest of the world's, bullet train systems combined in such a short period of time? And India actually, as late as like the 90s, Indian Railways was sort of on par in scale and technical sophistication with a lot of Chinese railways. And, people I talk to who are like in the international development world who have experience working in both countries, they tell me that it's not the engineers. The engineers are extremely talented in India. In fact, in some ways, they had longer standing access to English-based resources that, sort of global industry standards. So that wasn't the issue. There was something else about why China could build this high-speed rail network and why India struggled to kind of modernize its own very, very useful and economically important and socially important railway system. And yet somehow building a single high-speed rail line was a monumental undertaking. I mean, it would be for any country, frankly. So in some ways, the real sort of outlier is China's case, but using India sort of as a foil to understand that. And so, yeah, that whole project was trying to understand, at a sort of, I call it like the meso level of analysis. Because I think there's a lot of people who look at like what the top leaders are thinking in any country, whether the prime minister or the president or what is Xi Jinping thinking. That's fine. And they're great people who can like read the tea leaves on that. And then there's some people who focus on the really nitty gritty, like bureaucrat level or at the, single company level. And that can be very fascinating too. But I kind of look at the meso level organizational structures across the bureaucracy, looking at, at a time, India and China were two of the last countries with ministries of railways. So looking at how those were organized and why, on the surface, they look the same. But when you start to peek under the hood, the whole structure is completely different. I mean, China's system, ironically, was less top down. In a way, a lot of the responsibility was sort of devolved or delegated down to these like project corporations. And there, basically, I mean, these were tiny teams relative to the size of these projects. I mean, you're talking about sort of like multi-billion-dollar high-speed rail projects, basically run by 100 or less people ultimately. And what that did is that concentrated a lot of that power and responsibility into like, again, not the very top, but still a core group that was, living there, breathing this project all the time. And in the Indian case, it was much more of this sort of typical matrix structure with cross-cutting, lines of authority. Basically, I can understand the rationale for why they had it the way they had. You have different functional divisions overlaid on top of sort of regional structures. But ultimately, it just caused a lot of confusion in terms of who was in charge, who could make the final say. And a lot of these projects are about trade-offs, right? You need to make a decision. You're either going to be on budget or you're going to go over budget, but you can actually hit your schedules. So, somewhere along the line, someone's going to make the call. And someone also has to be responsible when something goes wrong. So that's, again, going back to the whole like as a level structure, like that to me was so fascinating. So much happening at that level of analysis.
So after years of what I assume included field work and also, reading lots of papers and studying lots of other people's work, have you reached a conclusion for why the Chinese developed differently than the Indian one?
Yeah. So the theory I offer is the structure of the bureaucracies in the two countries. Yeah, that China sort of reformed its system from a system that looked more like India's, more top-down, more centralized, to this one that was based around yeah, on the one hand, these railway project companies, these sort of specialized state-owned enterprises that were formed to manage railway projects. And actually, a lot of this was learned from the Japanese. There's actually a whole history there of like, going back to the 70s and 80s, learning from Japanese project management techniques. I hope to actually do a project one day looking at that historically. But being able to sort of like have these nodes, that's sort of the argument that I make. This sort of nodal structure. There's key nodes in the bureaucratic organizational structure where power and responsibility are concentrated, and that's how you get things done. Whereas for India, I argue that it's more diffuse. That you have all these cross-cutting structures. That a lot of very mundane decisions are kicked up all the way to the top because nobody feels like they can take responsibility. And to be fair, there are many parts of the Chinese bureaucracy elsewhere that still have some of these same issues. So these are not like purely Chinese or purely Indian, but focusing on the railway bureaucracies in particular gave me that sort of leverage to control for, these are two countries with state-owned railway systems and, yada, yada. All these things are observable and controlled. And then, but this is something that's different. So yeah, that was sort of the overarching takeaway from that.
I'm curious whether you've read any of Glenn Luke's work. Are you familiar with Glenn?
Yeah.
Pretty big on it.
Of course. Yeah.
But really in-depth studies of the financial viability of the Chinese rail system. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, just that some of it is not as clear to me. I actually find Glenn's analysis very interesting. Yeah, because but overall, my take on the whole financial sustainability question is that I do think that a lot of sort of Western analysts are missing the forest for the trees when it comes to understanding this. I mean, this is not a project investment that's supposed to generate an IRR on the project itself. That's not the main goal. The goal is to build something that will have broad economic spillovers across the entire country. And that's hard to measure. Mm-hmm. And there's been very creative economists that have tried to use sort of spatial models, land value, appreciation to try to capture some of that. And I look at their work a lot. I find it very useful. But at the end of the day, yeah, it's a different approach you have to take rather than focusing strictly on, okay, is this single project going to return a profit or is the whole railway system going to return a profit? You got to think about like, this is an investment in the entire country essentially. And there you can solve waste for sure. That's not to say that it all worked out, but to think about the whole system and its broader impact, I think is really crucial.
Now, after you finished your PhD and you became a postdoctoral researcher, did you sort of consciously out your that you would be interested in?
Yeah, exactly. So I started to realize that there's a lot of overlap between infrastructure development and industrial policy that both entail long-term investments and have massive coordination problems, and in some cases, the state can step in and help in some way. And these are also two areas where China has just been very, very good at doing what it does. So I see that some of the strengths and some of the issues come up in both. That is, sort of like erring on the side of investing too much, focusing on scale and speed, maybe going a bit overboard when it comes to replication or redundancies, and an appetite for risk-taking is one way to characterize it, or waste is another way to characterize it. But both infrastructure and industrial policy, I saw that similar patterns, even similar institutions involved. So, but of course, a key difference is just that the industrial policy was across more sectors and involved this combination of, in many cases, private sector, private company, sort of shaping markets, basically. So I found that to be really interesting.
This topic of industrial policy and whether it can work or not, I'm much older than you. And so I've seen this play out over a really long period of time, with, the argument shifting, quite a bit over multiple decades. And I think right now, I think you're well positioned because I think China is providing an example where it seems like industrial policy has worked out. And I think for the last few decades, people in the West have been, or at least American economists have been really conditioned to think that that's just a recipe for disaster, that governments can't really execute properly and can't get things done. And so maybe the pendulum will start swinging back now.
Yeah, I think so. I think China's both an interesting example that has sort of galvanized other people's interests and maybe caused, us in the US or elsewhere to question our assumptions about, oh, the state intervention is always going to be always going to backfire. The other thing is China itself is a factor prompting a lot of countries to reconsider industrial policy. Now we have rare earths, all in the news, but you can pick sort of many different industries where China is very strong or very dominant, and there are questions about how to stay competitive in a world with China in it. And I think maybe our attitudes towards industrial policy might be different if there wasn't a China type player in the system, in the global system.
Write a paper, or you're formulating, you're working on something, your research, and you're trying to come to a conclusion or reach a level in the argumentation where you think, okay, this will be convincing to a target set of other researchers. Who are those people? Are they sociologists? Are they at the Kennedy School of Government? Are they economists? Who do you think of as evaluating the arguments that you're making in your papers?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question because I have a number of different audiences in mind. Some are the people who also study Chinese industrial policy and China's political economy. And especially if I'm writing something more sort of academic, then I would have them in mind, as well as other sort of think tank researchers as well who focus on those areas. But ideally, actually, I also have in mind like a more general audience, like Americans broadly, or Americans who sort of care about what's happening in the world or care about what's happening, even in their own backyards. Because I see a lot of like domestic issues are tied up with U.S.-China relations, or what China's doing, or what the U.S. is doing vis-a-vis China. And yeah, that's why what I try to do in many cases is try to use language that is not always so specialized for like China experts or people who are sort of like spending their 24/7 in this area. So yeah, and that's part of like this New York Times piece. I realized that there's actually a lot of knowledge and understanding that's kind of locked away by scholars and researchers who have been kind of like interested in this stuff for a long time, but just talking to each other. And, every time I talk with them, I'm always reminded, like, there is just incredibly deep expertise, people who have been doing field work or traveling to China or studying China in some fashion for many, many years. But there's a huge gap between what they know and what folks in DC know, what folks in Silicon Valley know. It's changing. It's definitely changing for sure. But just the broader sort of American business and investment community writ large. So yeah, trying to kind of bridge that gap, I think I didn't realize how big a gap there was. I had been so long sort of like hanging out with my other China scholars that I just sort of took a lot of these for granted and realized like, oh, wow, not only is there a lack of knowledge or maybe even sort of misunderstanding, but these have really big policy consequences. If you have not a fully formed view or a misguided view of like how China works, that can lead to really, really bad policy decisions. So that's also what I've been concerned about lately.
Yeah, which I've talked to various guests about at length is the AI and chip competition, but maybe we'll get there later in the podcast.
Oh yeah.
I definitely feel your pain because I feel like I'm in a position where the people that consume my content might be academic economists or think tank people, or actually, business people that compete with Chinese companies or actually operate in China. So there's such a broad range of understanding, ranging from people who think they actually have a social score, a social credit program to, people who actually run factories themselves and live in China. So such a broad gamut.
Yeah.
Nice piece. Maybe we can talk about that a little bit. So,
sure.
Opinion piece. And now it's got an interesting title, and often the title is by the editor, not by the author. So I'm going to ask you about that. The title of the piece, it's a guest essay in the New York Times opinion section. And the title is, "In the Future, China Will Be Dominant. The U.S. Will Be Irrelevant." Now, pretty strong title. Tell me where that title came from.
I can tell you it did not come from me. And yeah, like I have to be careful what I say about that title. But let's just say I was pretty shocked when I saw that, and I saw it on the day that the piece came out. So
Did you get specifically because of the title?
it's funny. I got like a tsunami of like emails and messages and responses to that piece. I mean, I was really surprised because I thought, again, this is sort of like me coming from China research world. I was like, this is probably not surprising to a lot of people, both what I'm saying about China and what I'm saying about the US. I mean, I'm not saying anything so new. And when I talk to my fellow China experts and China scholars, they're like, oh yeah, yeah. I mean, that kind of put together a lot of stuff that we've been studying. But yeah, I was like blown away by the reception. And yeah, I could tell the difference between people who just got stuck on the headline versus people who read the piece. And then even people who read the piece, I'm still like, that's not my best work. my real work is something else. Like read my other writing or read my other research because this is sort of just like an overview. You know, I get into more like what I consider to be more real analysis elsewhere.
Right.
But yeah, that has been quite a journey.
Now, since that article came out, are you now officially a CCP shill?
Yeah, it's so funny. I got called all sorts of things. And, you know, I think both of us are pretty active on Twitter and or X. And, you know, you develop thick skin. And yeah, even then, after that piece, I still got like some new ones. Yeah, CCP is shill on the one hand, but then also some people who really didn't like, you know, my use of the word like China as a threat or something, or, you know, I get a lot of flack from both sides, I gotta say. So
Yeah,
it's fine.
You get it from both sides. So, you know, even if you say they're a competitor, you know, people who say, and I think with reason, they might ask, well, why do you have to think of them as a competitor? Why couldn't we cooperate?
Right.
So you're going to get criticized from both sides usually.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's just part of the game.
So I felt that piece was totally reality based. So in other words, you mentioned a lot of things in the piece, which I think for people who are really following the U.S. China, you know, shall we say, competition, these are key indicators. Like where is the EV industry? Where is renewable energy? Where are chips? You know, where ship manufacture, shipbuilding? You know, all these things. I think for people who are serious and follow the numbers, nothing you said in the piece was particularly controversial or even necessarily new to people who are deep experts in the field. But I think the average New York Times reader, probably in aggregate, it was a shocking article. Like for the people who actually read it all the way through and thought about it, I would guess well over 50%, maybe 80% of the people who read it were a little bit shocked by the end. What do you think?
Yeah. I think so. And I did mean for it to be a little shocking. I kind of wanted to cut through the noise a bit and connect the dots for people because, yeah, I think, and I was talking to the editor about this that I worked with, like there are a lot of stories about, you get a story about BYD, or you get a story about Chinese EVs, or you get a story about like DeepSeek, right? So you had like the whole DeepSeek moment. And people are focused on like that particular company sometimes. And if they're more sophisticated, they might kind of see the industry as changing and China moving up the ladder in that particular industry. But I just hadn't heard that many people in sort of like mainstream media talking about all of these different sectors, all these different scientific fields as well, sort of backing. And that's a big story as well that I know you've actually written about. So there's just these bigger trends happening behind each of these individual sectors. And so, yeah, like, you know, I'm sure some of the people who you speak with and probably who listen to this podcast, you know, they might be deep in the weeds on like biotech in China and being like, wow, there's some big changes happening here. Some of the oncology treatments are really taking off. The pace of clinical trials is really incredible, but they might not have a view into the shipbuilding world, or it might be very sort of light. And so to kind of put it all together and just be like, look, this is not just a single sector or a single industry or a single company. It's not just DeepSeek or BYD or, you know, any of these ones that make the headlines. It's a much, much broader pattern. And that's why we need to wake up. Like, you know, we can't just be like, well, you know, we'll concede that one. Solar panels, sure. You know, who need, you know, you can make cheap solar panels, whatever. But like a lot of these, and especially the point about the industries of the future. I know this is sort of like a hackneyed term now these days, but I really believe that the areas that China is really focused on are the building blocks for the next generation of technologies, emerging sectors that are going to be not only sort of like the economic growth engines, the job engines of the future, but sort of broader progress is going to be built on that. AI, robotics, all the stuff that we've all heard about. But I want to bring attention to some of those things too. It's not just today, it's like the trend going forward that people need to pay attention to.
Yeah, I think a moderately competent government, you don't have to be super duper competent, your government officials, but if you're moderately competent and you listen to area experts, it's not that hard to formulate a kind of China 2025 plan where you might compare a few different areas and say, which of these should we put more weight on or more resources behind, because they will, as you say, be the building blocks for the future. It's not that hard, I think, for them to like pick the right ones. What's unique about China, and this is something I think both you and I have written about, is there are a few factors which affect verticals. So you have, the surprising thing is, as you said, you have all these different verticals where if you were able to go into the weeds in each of them and determine where is US versus China competitiveness in this particular vertical of like humanoid robotics or self-driving cars or cancer treatment, whatever it is, you would see them advancing across almost all of them simultaneously very fast. And the factors that underlie that are, one, human capital. They have just extremely population
absolutely
and engineers. They sort of have their act together at the government level. Like I just said, the government can maybe not pick individual winners, but they do know what areas to pump resources into. And then third, they know enough to get out of the way and let actual market forces determine which companies actually win in the space. So if the competition is somewhat fair, and different regions, different cities have their own individual companies, car manufacturers, for instance, that have to actually compete in the entire domestic market globally, then quality will rise to the top. And so if you have those three factors, then you can advance simultaneously in each of these verticals all at once. But I think still most Americans don't realize that those factors are in place, and indeed that they are advancing in each of those at the same time. I think that even that basic idea, which you conveyed well in the piece, is pretty new to most people in America.
Yeah, I think you characterize it really well. Yeah, I think, I have to kind of like step back and see China through the eyes of someone who doesn't follow China all the time. And that's actually hard for me to do. So like, I think some of the ideas of how Chinese industrial policy works that are out there are like, either it's like a very top-down system, like Beijing leaders, or Xi Jinping himself says something and everyone executes.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, I think they tried that maybe in the past, and the sort of a command economy structure, and that didn't work out so well. And also another idea is that you just kind of like flood the zone with subsidies. And again, if it were that simple, like at a certain point, you're going to run out, right? Like if you're not going to build competitive industries, if these companies don't upgrade technologically and become, not just domestically competitive, but globally competitive to a certain extent, then you can't just subsidize in front. You're going to run out. So like at a certain point, it's about, as you said, kind of like shaping the market, shaping the ecosystem, like providing, I kind of think about, I know you're a physicist, and I love the physics analogies, but I often reach for the biological ones more when it comes to industrial policy. And it's like, you can't just like turn the knob all the way to 11 and expect that to work. It's, you want to kind of like add the ingredients that you think will help. If there's some key component or key, aspect that's missing, maybe the government can sort of backfill or contribute in that area. And then especially looking at sort of like problems in the supply chain and trying to fill those in. So that can be very useful. But overall, it's this mix. You're right. It's not just like top down. It's also not just flood the zone. It's sort of like trying to cultivate this ecosystem. And AI is like a classic example of that, where it's like DeepSeek itself is not a state-owned enterprise, by any means. It's quite the opposite, right? But I would argue that, even though it's not a direct product of industrial policy in the traditional sense, the people who are the incredible like researchers who are doing the cutting edge research at DeepSeek, they came through the Chinese university system, which had investment, research grants, a lot of which was targeted AI. So that all sort of benefited that broader industrial ecosystem.
Yeah, one of the points I made in the wake of Mark Zuckerberg and hiring, with exorbitant salaries and comp packages, all of these top AI researchers from companies like OpenAI and elsewhere, is, a big chunk of those people were actually educated in China, at least at the undergraduate level. And one of the things if you're in my position, professor that is in a quantitative subject, you see that in China, because there's so much emphasis on math, solid grounding in math, even the software developers, people who are coders, generally have much better math chops than the coders in the United States. And so to do AI, there's a certain sort of core set of things you need to understand, like multivariable calculus, linear algebra, statistics, probability, things like that. It's very, very likely that a Chinese CS major actually has pretty good mastery of those things. And so they could, if they wanted to, do AI research. Whereas in the US, you're cutting it down by maybe like only a quarter of CS grads in the US are strong enough in those areas that they can they can download a paper from arXiv on AI and actually read it, on large language models, and actually read and understand the matrix notation and stuff like that. So tensor notation. So even a really basic commitment to just education, STEM education, it manifests itself in the pool from which they, for example, are able to draw from. And that would be the same thing if you were doing like computational methods in genomics or biotech or something like that. A lot more people in China are able to sit down and actually read papers in that area and actually apply what they read in those papers. Whereas in the US, it's much, much less common for a biologist to actually have that math background.
Yeah, that's really interesting to have that kind of scientific foundation. Yeah, it's funny here in Princeton, I like to kind of just like pop into random seminars in fields that are not my own. So and I have been to more than one CS seminar or CS talk where I look around, the entire auditorium is like almost all Chinese. The speaker is Chinese, and I'm like, you literally could just have this whole talk in Chinese right now.
Oh, absolutely.
Like in theory. But but it's just sort of like a testament to kind of like the strength of the talent pool, the depth of the talent pool. And you can see it even out here in Princeton at the graduate level. I mean, it's very, very obvious. So yeah, when I saw that, these sort of like Damien Ma and Macropolo had sort of like the tracker of AI talent, and over 40%, almost 50% comes from China. And then now, with sort of Meta's super intelligence team, like seeing how many people came from China, I was just like, on the one hand, I was shocked. I was like, wow, that is, I mean, those guys, their lives are like, you can imagine their parents might have come from a generation that was like dirt poor, and they're going to get $100 million pay packages. I mean, what a change. But overall, it was just, it was surprising, but also not that surprising. I mean, it was like, if you look at the NeurIPS co-authors on like virtually like, a huge chunk of the papers, it's a lot of Chinese researchers or Chinese origin researchers. So it's just that kind of depth, I think, again, really hasn't been emphasized enough in trying to understand, the latest, where's the next DeepSeek coming from? Like this sort of like deeper level. Yeah.
In the sociology world, are people hostile to, if you break out human capital as a separate factor for productivity or development, are people hostile to that? I mean, certainly you couldn't link it. I mean, you couldn't link it to anything like genetics, but just even saying that this system produces more 22-year-olds that can do linear algebra per capita than this other system, like, is that an okay thing to do in sociology, or do people get mad at you over that?
Oh, I think education, human capital, the pipeline, I don't think those are controversial things. In fact, I think there are demographers who like specialize in sort of those questions. Yeah.
Because for example, like there's a guy called Garrett Jones. I don't know if you know him. He's at George Mason University. He's an economist, and he's done studies linking, like he tries to estimate the sort of average IQ of a whole country, which, is equivalent to just saying how well they do on PISA scores or TIM scores or something like this. And then he relates that to their economic growth rates and things like that. And of course, he doesn't mention DNA or genetics or anything like that. It's just country by country. There's an education system. It produces these outcomes. And maybe that is an important input factor into productivity growth or whatever. But even that, like, I think he's found it somewhat controversial. Like he's gotten some pushback that like one shouldn't be looking too closely at these things. I don't know. Apparently, maybe you have not felt that.
Yeah, I don't know. And also the funny thing is like in the business world, you talk about talent all the time. I mean, that's like the word that you use. So yeah, maybe that encompasses maybe a broader set of performance metrics or something like that. But whatever it is, like there's a sense out there that this matters a lot.
Yeah.
And if China has a lot of it, that also matters a lot.
Yeah. I think people still even today underrate how big the gap is because in almost every metric, if you look at in terms of human capital, if you look at China, it tends to dwarf the US and it tends to be more like China is roughly equivalent to rest of world combined. And
Yeah.
I think still people can't really quite absorb that fact, even though it's in the numbers.
Yeah. Well, also, I think people don't realize that like factories, like again, like a battery plant, you take kind of like a mid-level manager, the level of technical capabilities you need to have, and then you multiply that by across an entire factory and then times all the factories in that industry and then times all the industries. I mean, you really need, I was talking to someone about industrial robots and industrial automation and just deploying them. So it's not, you can't just sort of like install them and let them run. You need people who have the technical skills to be able to do that, to understand some of the mechanics, how to operate them, how to repair them, how to deploy them properly. And you need a lot of those people. I mean, the scale of what's happening in China in terms of manufacturing, in terms of the number of new factories being open or factories where, these automation systems have to be serviced or managed. Yeah, you just think about the number of people who are needed who are at that level. And that's something that I think a lot of people don't realize.
Yeah.
Is
so
different.
You've probably seen these videos of EV factories where they're turning out a car like roughly every minute. And there are these robot arms that are simultaneously welding and moving a plate into place and doing. And if you just think of the spatial reasoning required to install, like even if the robots all came from Germany, which is not true anymore, actually, mostly they're built in China, the robots, but get the robots, like placing them and solving these problems, so that all the arms work properly and the car is placed in a certain position. Like all of that is actually very, very, to use the verboten term, very G loaded. Like a lot of people just can't do that. Like if I said, this is your job and figure out where to place these robots so all of these arms can operate simultaneously without screwing each other up and they can get into the part of the car where they need to get into. And, we need to put it in this corner of the factory on this conveyor belt. A lot of people just solve that problem. It's actually a pretty difficult problem to solve. And the way you solve it affects the overall efficiency of your factory. Like how many square meters of factory do you need to actually do what you want to do, right? So all these things are just require a ton of human capability.
Totally. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Maybe we can move your Times piece to the Substack. It wasn't just you. I guess there were multiple authors, right, on that. And so we maybe should give credit to your co-authors. But I was interested in the philosophy of this gentleman, Lu Feng, who's at, I think, Beijing University. Maybe just tell us a little bit about the article and this individual.
Yeah. So Lu Feng, he is a very prominent, I don't know how to categorize him now, a political economist. And he has done a lot of work on industrial development in China in particular. In particular, this piece, so it was Thomas at Sinification who actually asked me, he found the piece, so he should get credit. And he asked me to write an introduction to it, given that it was related to what I work on. And this piece talked about what I called industrial maximalism. That is all the arguments that you hear like from the West, the critiques, the criticisms about overcapacity, about how China should shift away from sort of more industrial development and towards, consumption or less production. And, all these things that his piece was saying almost the exact opposite. He was saying China should double down on manufacturing, on industrial capacity. he even had a whole part where like even steel, he argued, was not at a state of overcapacity. I thought that was so bold, so if anything, I just found the piece almost like a like a very erudite troll of like a lot of the Western critiques. But I also found it to be really fascinating, like point by point. And I wish that maybe I can find a way to get out the whole version in English, because it's very, very long. It's this very long interview where he's talking about what he thinks are the sources of strength for China's industrial development, why he thinks the US can't do that, why other countries have struggled. He has a lot of actually very interesting cases where he looks at specific companies. Some of these semiconductor companies today in China, they had their roots going back even to the to the pre-reform years. So I find all this historical stuff very interesting as well. But yeah, overall, this argument that China needs more of this, that actually this is the direction that China should be focused on. I just found it so fascinating. And yeah, he has a few little jabs too at JD Vance with the peasants comment and things like that. So I think he had fun with this Q&A in addition to sort of making a serious argument.
Right. So the original document, it was a Q&A. Where is it published? Like, what's the Chinese audience that it's actually aimed at?
Oh yeah, so I think this was Guancha, which is, I don't know how to characterize it. So it is a state affiliate media. It is it's sort of a very prominent platform for a lot of, researchers will write pieces on there. I wouldn't call it quite the New York Times of China, but it has that kind of intellectual sort of exchange.
Would be other economists, academics, but also policy people, business people.
Yeah. I think broadly speaking, yeah.
Okay, a piece that I read in translation was already pretty long, and you're saying the whole thing is actually even longer.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. He goes into like sort of history lessons, and I mean it's very interesting. Again, like he really pulls out a lot of case examples and sort of dives into them. But yeah, I think one of the biggest takeaways actually was just thinking about like industrial capacity as not just something about building physical factories, but as sort of this, and this relates to my work, the sort of organizational capacity that a society has to be able to do this, tying back to what we're talking about with talent, tying back to what we're talking about with, having a at least sort of like decently operating government that can implement some of these things. So yeah, that's where I think I found it very useful that he was sort of trying to cut through some of the previous ideas of like, oh, a lot of the stuff just got outsourced to China. Well, if it were so easy, why isn't every other country doing that, right? Things aren't just outsourced to China. Like China created a system to make it attractive for other companies to set up their operations there. They did a lot of, industrial policy to not only do that, but to make sure that the learnings from those companies got transferred over in some way and absorbed. And again, all these terms, I mean, even the word tech transfer, unfortunately, just like it is not about handing someone a piece of knowledge, right? It is. I like the term actually sort of like absorption capacity in a way more, because, and this comes back to sort of China's scientific foundations, that it's one thing other countries have tried to lure foreign companies to build plants in their jurisdictions and train their workers, and then it sort of just ends there. And the question is, why has China been able to get that technology and sort of technical knowledge and have it diffuse throughout society more broadly, and then create homegrown competitors that can not only catch up, but then actually, move beyond that. So that's sort of, to me, the most interesting question. So I like Lu Feng's sort of readjustment of how to see some of these issues.
Yeah, I think people in China are aware of this unique aspect that the foreign company Apple comes in, there is knowledge absorption, but the Chinese are able to both contribute to Apple's innovation in trying to localize the process, right, but then also potentially go beyond it and create competitors. And episode of Manifold, I interviewed the author of the book Apple in China, which is a really, really exhaustive look at the operations of Apple in China, and then how that gave rise to domestic smartphone manufacturers, and how actually today we discuss this at length, like most of the leading innovation is actually happening in China when it comes to smartphones. And in a way, Apple is actually kind of a laggard now in terms of the features
Yeah, yeah,
and the capability. So that's a very
yeah. Similar with Tesla.
yeah. And if you want a very specific, in-depth discussion, that episode of Manifold, I think is very good. That I forgot the author's name, but he's extremely good.
Patrick McGee. Yeah, he was really great. I actually interviewed him too
Yeah,
for a different podcast.
He spent a huge amount of time writing this book. So let's maybe steelman both sides of this. So from the Western side, where this term overcapacity comes from, the idea is something like, wow, these autistic Chinese guys just keep building more factories, and they just keep wanting to make more stuff, and they don't have good profit margins. They're just driving. It's a race to the bottom. They're just making so much of this stuff and flooding the world with cheap, maybe high quality now. We grudgingly admit it's high quality, but cheap stuff. And they should just calm down and relax, like people in Europe or California, and take more time off and do other stuff. And it's just a mistake for them to be so frantic.
Yeah,
focus on industrial production, technology, all this stuff. And you could say, like, if someone said that to Lu Feng, what would his response be?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think his response would be that this is something that is helping consumers in the rest of the world. And this is a product of China's investment in trying to develop like this very sophisticated manufacturing platform, right? This whole system of industrial clusters, of, technological upgrading that makes it, uniquely capable of producing relatively affordable, high quality products. Yeah.
Things I wrote a whole thread on this on X, because I really did enjoy the, your translation of the article. Is that throughout most of the 20th century, there were, or at least during the history of the People's Republic, there were American sanctions, Western sanctions on China. So they could not get Western technology until that opening period under Deng. And so you can't blame them for wanting to surmount those technological hurdles as fast as possible, because previously they were denied the ability to do so. So if they're a little bit overly indexed or overly focused on technology catch up, they have things like the Opium War to look back on, right? So I think they still feel like they're playing catch up, even if they've now caught up. They still feel like they're playing catch up. People tend to, pendulums tend to overswing, right? So they feel like they still want to over index on this stuff, and they're going to keep pushing. And there's a little bit of paranoia, which for them is justified. Like they remember during the Korean War, the U.S. just flatly threatened to use nuclear weapons against them, right? Like we forgot that. Most Americans can't remember that one.
Yeah.
Like that never happened, did it? And then you look it up and you realize, yeah, in fact, it did. And they never forgot that, right? That there was a period where they were under technological embargo. Thing pisses them off so much. But they were under technological embargo, and at the same time, MacArthur was urging, the U.S. to just drop nuclear weapons on Manchuria, nuclear bombs on Manchuria. So they remember that, and that is definitely going to color their strategy, right? They're going to be more risk averse,
absolutely,
about ever falling behind in any one critical area, because they used to be behind, and they paid dearly for that, right? So I think to put yourself in the psychology of the other side, even if you don't even if you don't agree with it, even if you just say like, oh, that anti-China Cold War hysteria, that was an aberration. We'll never see that again. Americans are so diverse and nice now, that could never happen again. You still have to allow for the fact that the other side doesn't believe you. Like they experienced all this stuff.
Right.
It's the potential victim of it.
Yeah.
They're not going to give up on that right away. They might give up on it in 10 or 20 years. Like in 10 or 20 years, Chinese kids might be lazy and, like lying around all day, but it won't happen for a while. So right now, they're still very, very focused on working hard to get ahead.
Yeah. And in fact, if anything, I think going back to that Lu Feng piece, he sees it as sort of a natural kind of progression of deindustrializing. That this is just kind of what happens over the course of time for a society. Unless someone steps in and tries to alter, especially the financial system, to try to allocate resources in such a way that incentivizes that industrial capacity to remain. But yeah, the broader point about self-reliance, this paranoia, being in a world that is very insecure, where someone can cut you off. Later on, it was the Soviets that were the big threat. And then now, most recently, like all of these fears, like imagine you have been like afraid of something your entire life and people have been telling you, don't worry about it, don't worry about it, it's okay, it's okay. And then it turns, you're afraid of like a robber, burglar entering your house, and people are like, it's not gonna happen. And then a burglar actually enters your house, and then you're like, confirmed, all of my like safe room, investments were worth it. And in fact, I'm going to double down now. So that's actually what's happening now, I think, with the export controls, with the Huawei sanctions, with all of these, it's sort of like, I joke that there's sort of like a rule of three. When a Chinese company gets mentioned 3 times in international media, like it will take, within 3 years, it will be entity listed. And this sense that like at any moment we could be cut off, and so Xiaomi, Lei Jun has the whole story about how he thought Xiaomi was going to get cut off, and that was partly the reason why they pivoted to EVs. So this sort of fear, both at the policymaker level, but also at the company level, I think has like only sort of gone like further into overdrive with the actual sanctions that sort of validated all of these concerns. So yeah, this feeling of like, could we be cut off, and what do we do? How do we prepare now? That I think is really important for people to understand who are not, feeling that kind of sense of insecurity all the time.
Yeah, I think that, it will be a while, I would guess the time scale is decades before they feel comfortable enough that they can take their foot off the gas pedal. I think they're going to have their foot on the gas pedal for easily another decade. And if they've actually, so and you've probably seen me post on X these skull graphs where, like you look at US electricity production, it's kind of flat. And then you look at Chinese electricity, this, and then during this period of time where America is really dominant and they're the hegemon and the Chinese curve is way down there, it's like US is like we're number one, and then the curves cross, and when the curve crosses, then the American guy's like, oh shit. And then like, but they, because the first derivative is so large, this just keeps shooting up, and eventually you end up in this era where the Chinese are up here and the Americans are down here, and then there's like a little skull. And I just I don't see that letting up in most of these metrics, KPIs, for another decade or something.
Yeah, and they're making a big bet. I mean, they're betting that more investment in these scientific fields, more investment in these industries is the long run right thing to do.
Yeah.
And so it will be very interesting. I mean, we will watch the experiment unfold before our eyes.
Yeah.
Like we will see, like these are huge, huge bets. In many ways, I think the US should be doing something similar.
Yeah. Well,
like it doesn't have to be the same way exactly, but there are certain industries that, I think we realize now it would be a shame to kind of like sit back and hope that it all works out and not have tried to do something in the process.
I recently tweeted there was a article in MIT Technology Review, and they interviewed this economist David Autor, who I think he may have coined the term China shock, and now they're talking about China shock 2.0, where instead of shock on legacy industries like making cheap furniture or dolls or T-shirts, and of course that did affect American employment. Now it's 2.0, where it's the advanced industries, where they're threatening to take away the advanced industries from us. I wasn't expecting that post on X to get a lot of attention, but it did, because I think people didn't realize this was happening. And when they read David Autor saying it, they suddenly thought, okay, this has credibility. Like this guy's been saying this for 5 years, but we just ignore him. But this guy, David Autor, said it very explicitly. And so now we're actually.
He's the China shock guy. Yeah,
he's the China shock guy. But I think obvious prescription, I think Professor Autor would agree with me, is that the main thing is America has to actually strengthen itself and compete in those industries that it wants to.
Yes.
To reach a level of excellence where it can retain control of those industries or leadership in those industries. And you can't do that without all the usual things like industrial policy and R&D investment and production of human capital here at home, or at least stealing it from abroad, or however we get it. So, I mean, I think all these things are pretty clear.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, this is going back to like part of what got me so interested in these topics in the first place. I mean, how to understand them like in a broader sort of system level view, rather than seeing like this particular company that's maybe not profitable, or this particular industry where the economics just don't seem to work out. You see that some of these are links in this chain, or are nodes in this broader network. And if you break that critical node, you're going to have huge spillover effects onto all the other dependent industries and upstream and downstream linkages. These are all interconnected. And so, yeah, like to me, in some ways, the puzzling thing is not what China does, but what the U.S. does or doesn't do when it comes to these things, where it seems so glaringly obvious that, here is a coordination problem that is sitting right before our eyes, and we're all like kind of nodding our heads, being like, yeah, boy, that would be bad if we got cut off from this critical part of the supply chain. And then it happens, and we're like, oh, that was bad, but we still don't really step in. And yeah, the question is, can we kind of like overcome some of our very strong priors about what policy can do? And to be fair, I share like a strong sort of skepticism of state intervention. There are many cases where it does do a lot more harm than good. So, this is not just like a wholesale, like, oh yeah, we should take out, nationalize everything. But to think carefully about where the government could step in and at least support private industry in a way that wasn't just totally up to the markets and up to, global prices, which can be volatile or unpredictable. Yeah, that is something that I hope people think about more.
I mean, to take a specific example, like the Biden CHIPS Act, I was not very optimistic about what it would accomplish or that it would be conducted efficiently, but directionally, I was not against it. I was not against directionally.
Yeah.
Saying, hey, chips is an area we cannot lose. We have to support some domestic activity in this area. But of course, the devil details, like, can they actually execute properly?
Right.
And make it work?
Yeah.
I think for people who are really actually, so if you've done frontier level research in an academic lab and you've built a company, so you've seen both the application in a marketplace and also where do the original ideas come from. If you see those two things together, like, then you can understand like this ecosystem that's required for America to compete. But if you've only done one or the other, you could be wrong. So the university guy doesn't necessarily understand, like, most of the stuff people do at the university isn't that valuable and can't be commercialized. And the applied guy in Silicon Valley might not realize, like, oh, this thing that I can now think of 100 different uses of this thing. That came 20 years ago, that at the time it was considered a crazy idea, and only DARPA or NSF would fund it. Nobody else would fund it. And it's important to have both of those connections, and not a lot of people actually have seen both of those different parts of the ecosystem.
Yeah. If those people are out there, they should get to work, because we need that kind of, like, that intersection of experiencing and capabilities.
So right now we're doing everything wrong. We're making it harder for foreign students to come here and pursue their educations here. We're cutting funding to large chunks of science. It's all going to be, of course, maybe it's just going to be a transient hiccup that just lasts for a few years, but it could have really negative long-term consequences for U.S. competitiveness as well.
Yeah. And that's the thing that I don't know if I pointed it out in that piece, but the thing is, the like breakthrough treatments, medical treatments that are going to come out, in 20, 30 years, those are being researched, to your point, those are being researched today. There are labs who are testing, new sort of areas of research and exploring that now, who are getting their funding cut off. And there are a lot of sort of these forking paths that are just never going to happen because, at this stage they got sort of nipped in the bud.
But it is very hard. Like, if even some engineers who are more like, they've only worked in industry, they've only worked very close to like the market and the customer shipping a product, even they have a hard time understanding, like, what are you physics guys doing with superconductors? What's the point of that? Besides, like, there are people in Silicon Valley who think all these academics are useless, and if you just give some smart agentic engineer the problem, they can solve it. And they just lack a historical understanding of, like, the innovations that they currently work with. Where were those innovations 20 years ago, right? So it's very easy to get this thing wrong.
Yeah, actually, Huawei's Ren Zhengfei, Huawei's founder, he actually recently had a piece talking about this. It almost sounded like he was trying to convince people in China too of the value of sort of foundational science, of even like the way he characterized it, he was like, yeah, some of them are kind of weird characters, and we have to sort of like embrace them in our society because they are so valuable, and they might be kind of like a bit odd, and they might have like slightly odd ideas, but actually those are the seeds that are so later on that become basically the next Huawei or Nvidia or whatever it may be. So
yeah, I think I read, at least in translation, some of that. And yeah, I mean, he was, Huawei itself actually hires a lot of people who are doing sort of very mathematical or theoretical work, and a little bit surprising.
Right.
And I think he was urging other companies to do the same.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But in the future, for you, Kyle, the sort of U.S.-China competition, or China, the biggest story of the last 100 years, which is probably China development, or last 70 years at least, is where you intend to focus most of your energy going forward?
Yeah, and to continue to focus on develops in Chinese technology and science and industrial policy. So those are the main areas. So yeah, like I like to kind of like position myself as someone. I'm not going to be like a leading chip expert. There are people who are deep in the weeds on specific photoresists and can tell you, why, this versus that. That's not what I'm trying to do, but I'm trying to see, again, maybe the New York Times piece is actually useful as a characterization, where I'm trying to connect the dots here and see like what are the broader systemic factors that are contributing to this, and how is that shaping, not just the U.S.-China relationship, but sort of the China-global relationship. And I actually look at a lot of stuff too about China's interactions with global South countries or China and Europe, which I think is like maybe Americans don't care as much, but Europeans really care. And there are a lot of people who care about, the rest of the world. So those are all things that are, I think, very dynamic, and there's a lot of things happening. So those are areas I'm following very closely.
Let me throw out a couple speculative things. So there's one meme that's around on the internet that like China already won. And so if I were to steelman that, I would say something like, well, you look at any of these verticals and if they're not past, if they haven't surpassed us, they're coming close, and their first derivative is clearly much higher than ours. And this is happening across the 20 most important areas, and we're back together. And actually, the rigor of our education system is actually going slightly down as opposed to up. So how could we possibly win out? Now, the one scenario which I think, if you go around Silicon Valley and talk about this, some people will just say like they'll just deny that what I just said was true. So that's just a different, I think, perception of reality. But for the people who accept that that's, in terms of the metrics, that is actually a fair characterization of what's going on, the usual place where the Silicon Valley people can still pin their hopes is the following: fast takeoff in AGI led by Americans, and that's the one thing that saves our asses, right? It's literally what people. So again, we could be people who just don't believe me that the skull curve predominates, right? Like they would argue, they're not really ahead in rocketry, or they're not really ahead in this, or they're not really close to us in jet engines. They could argue stuff like that. So that's a different category of person. But for the people who accept these numbers, and I think the numbers actually are, as I present them, are correct. Usually, if they're technologists, the thing that they're going to retreat to is we're going to win the AGI battle, and that's what's going to keep us. That's what's going to.
That'll be like the trump card.
Yeah, And therefore, like, please nationalize my company and write me a check for $10 billion. So,
right.
But what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, well, so one thing that's very interesting that I follow is the debate in China about the 0 to 1 versus 1 to 100 sort of innovation scale up thing. And it's still an ongoing debate. I mean, I think people still debate like what was DeepSeek? Was it a 0 to 1 innovation, or was it another fast following thing? And you can go back to like mRNA vaccines or sort of other areas where I think there is still a sense of like, I don't know, like, could China have done this? What counts as an innovation? There are other people who argue that like drone technology or like LiDAR systems today are essentially a Chinese invention now, because yes, like parts of that have been out there for a while, but to really become a real thing in the world, is something that China did basically. So that's all over the map. And I guess one thing I will say on the U.S. side is there are possibly, I mean, maybe this applies equally well to the Chinese side, but I would just have a big dose of humility for like, I don't know what the next sort of ChatGPT might be. Because to me, ChatGPT was itself like so huge. And I guess, if I had been following a little more closely, I would have known that like, okay, GPT 3.5 was already out, and that's actually not, it was actually not even the hottest model. But still, there's just, I feel like we're just living in a time of very large, frequent paradigm shifts in technology. And then you can zero in on specific industries. You can look at like batteries. I mean, it was just yesterday, I felt like, when NMC batteries were seen as the standard, and then you have the shift to LFP, and then maybe solid state, or maybe sodium ion. Sodium will be next. Like, who knows? I now feel like we're in this state where it's not like a single race, or it's not like a one and done type deal. So yeah, I will be curious. Like, this is sort of hedging, sort of like punting on the question, but I actually think it's just sort of exciting. I mean, I hope that both countries continue to push the scientific and technological frontiers for humanity's sake, in terms of like coming up with better medical treatments, coming up with sort of like better things to help with our material lives. I think, what's not to love about that?
I like this optimistic perspective. It's so seldom articulated. China Talk host Jordan, is it Schneider?
Jordan Schneider. Yep.
So I was talking to him a year or two ago about this stuff, and at the time I just said, "Look, isn't this great? Like, all these technologists in China, they're selling you their stuff at rock bottom prices. Like, they're making stuff efficiently." They're selling it to you, and they're actually starting to make real fundamental breakthroughs, like, new battery technologies, or new AI models. So what's not to love? It's just like a huge number of scientists and technologies and factories appear in one corner of the planet, but they're selling everything to the rest of the world at rock bottom prices. What's not to love? Like, that's just a great optimistic future. And he just couldn't believe I was saying that. He was like, "Yeah, but aren't you worried about what happens if they become the hegemon and stuff like that?" And I'm like, "No, I'm not really that worried about it." But the optimistic future we should aim for is one where the U.S. and China can coexist and mutually benefit each other, right? It sounds like a cliche, like win-win is a cliche, but I still think it's possible.
Yeah. I mean, I just think, like, just from a pure sort of science standpoint, like, yeah, it would be so sad to have so much scientific capability bifurcated and isolated from each other, when in fact that's really, like, I don't know what the term is, but like, you want that kind of multiplier effect where like each group alone can do a lot, but you want all of it to be, sort of intermingling and fusing. Yeah.
Like hot war. I don't think the science and technology ecosystems can fully decouple between the two countries, because you still have flow of human capital back and forth. And now with AI and people publishing papers and stuff, that the information spread, the knowledge spreads so fast, faster than it ever has.
Yeah.
So I don't think, if we have a hot war, who knows, like maybe the whole planet will be destroyed. But I think in general, we will benefit from any investment, whether it's made in China or the United States, in fundamental research. The whole world actually does eventually benefit from that.
Yeah, I would point to GitHub as like, just spend time on GitHub. Just see who's contributing, who's, you can see like all the different names, different people around the world. I mean, it's just amazing. People who have never met each other, people who may never meet each other, and building like complex software that is usable, that is actually, companies use that as the foundations for some of their commercial services. Yeah, I just think that's so incredible. Maybe, I can see, yes, there could be like dark clouds on the horizon in terms of, some of these issues flaring up. But yeah, I mean, in some ways, again, I just think we're also so interconnected. I think you're right that some of these kinds of knowledge flows, it would be very, like, to cut them off would mean like quite a severe I don't know, like state of repression for yourself, essentially,
Yeah.
much less for the other guy.
Well,
So, yeah,
your example of GitHub is really one of the best because that even goes beyond the US-China thing. Because if you look on GitHub, the barrier to entry to write code, to develop software is so low, and the cost of hardware is so low now that, you see names lots of really strong developers come from Eastern Europe, from Turkey, from Iran, from, Central Asia. It's like everybody in the world is able to. GitHub is probably a very unique place in which everybody in the world can contribute. Unlike in, say, molecular biology or physics, you need to have access to a very high quality home institution to be able to participate at the frontier. On GitHub, almost everybody can contribute. Some poor kid in India who just has a shitty internet connection and maybe is even coding. They're coding on their phone or some $100 laptop. They can contribute on GitHub. So that's probably the best example, actually.
Yeah. So that's an area where if you see that world, like I feel like a lot of people who are not in the software or coding world don't know about things like that. And if you do know about things, you realize like, wow, there can be like incredible collaboration worldwide. And, talk about democratizing the process. I mean, that is really like, pretty mind blowing what you can contribute. You don't even know who like might be able to solve some bug or some puzzle that you've been unable to crack. And it could be someone from anywhere at any level of education almost.
That's a nice, optimistic place. Maybe we can end our conversation. So, Kyle, thanks a lot for being on the podcast, and I wish you all the best.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.